2025-2026 preseason college basketball poll isn't released yet, but it's looking like it is either going to be Houston, Purdue, or the defending national champions Florida as your preseason #1 team. If it were my opinion, I would go with Purdue. I think that they are returning one of the best players, if not the best player, and the best point guard in the country in Braden Smith, along with a bunch of other returning talent, players out of the portal, players out of high school that they have recruited. I think Purdue is set up really well to be the potential best team in the country this upcoming year. But what I want to do in this video is go back all the way from now all the way back to the year 2000, so back 25 years, and look at every single preseason #1 team since then in college basketball, and not only see who they were, but see how they finished the season and how many of those teams actually went on to make the Final Four or even win the national championship. I'm ready to get right into it. I just want to say subscribe if you guys are new. We got a ton of college basketball content here on the channel, especially whenever the season gets in full swing and we are getting closer and closer. So make sure you guys subscribe now. Without further ado, let's get it going. We're going to start with last year's preseason #1 team, and it was the Kansas Jayhawks. And looking at how the things turned out for them in the season, I did not even remember that they were the #1 team in the country heading into last season, but they did have Hunter Dickinson returning. They had DeJuan Harris Jr. returning, which was one of the best playmaking point guards in the country. They brought in Zeke Mayo, AJ Storr, Rylan Griffin, and had a top tier transfer portal where AJ Storr was ranked as, I think, the #1 or #2 transfer that offseason. So Kansas came in as the #1 team, and already they're not off to a hot start for preseason #1 teams because they finished last season as a 7 seed heading into March Madness and lost in the first round to the 10 seed Arkansas team that went on to beat St. John's after Kansas and made it to the Sweet 16. So already not a hot start. Preseason #1 teams. Let's see if 2024 is any better. In 2024, it is also the Kansas Jayhawks. They were, again, the preseason #1 team in the country, and they were coming in, bringing in Hunter Dickinson, who was the #1 transfer portal in that offseason. They had Kevin McCullar returning, which was a big-time piece for them, and they also had guys like KJ Adams, Johnny Furphy, surrounding these guys to where they thought they were going to be the best team once again, coming off just 2 seasons removed from a national championship and bringing in some of the best transfers in the country. So they were the #1 team back-to-back years, the past 2 years, and again, they lost. Again, not as good as they were expected to be. A little bit better than last year where they were a 7 seed. They were a 4 seed heading into the tournament. They almost lost to Samford, and everybody who was watching that game who is not in a 200-mile radius of Lawrence, Kansas, knew that Samford should have won that game and that they did get robbed. So they honestly probably should have lost in the first round, but they did get a second-round exit to the 5th-seeded Gonzaga Bulldogs in 2024. And now to 2023, we are moving on from Kansas, and we are going to talk about a team that had a ton of hype heading into this 2023 season, because in 2022 they made a deep run all the way to the national championship game as an 8 seed and lost to the Kansas Jayhawks in that championship game, and that is North Carolina, coming off of a runner-up year as an 8 seed and returning 4 of their 5 starters: Armando Bacot, Caleb Love, RJ Davis, Leaky Black. I mean, this was a squad. Everybody knew that they had potential to run it back next year and maybe take it home. But I believe this is actually the only team since 2000 that we will be talking about on this list that missed the March Madness tournament completely after being the preseason #1 team. And they had so much hype. That was such a disappointing year for North Carolina, and wow, I honestly still can't believe they didn't even make the March Madness tourney. Next up, we do have 2022, and this is going to be the Gonzaga Bulldogs, and they were coming off of another team coming off of a runner-up year where they did lose to Baylor in the championship game, where that was actually their only loss on the season. They were undefeated heading into that championship game where they did lose to Baylor in 2021. And not only were they coming off of a runner-up year, but they were bringing back Drew Timme and bringing in the number one recruit of that class in Chet Holmgren. So definitely, in my opinion, deserve to be the number one preseason team. I mean, that was a stacked team, bringing in the number one player in Chet Holmgren of that recruiting class, and they ended up having a good regular season, ended up being a 1 seed in that year, 2022, but they did lose in the Sweet 16 to 4-seeded Arkansas in a little bit of an upset. So definitely still a disappointing year. We're back 4 seasons now, and still that is the furthest anyone has made it over the past 4 seasons as the preseason number 1 team is to the Sweet 16. But we go back one more year, and it is Gonzaga, and I already kind of spoiled how they did finish. They were undefeated this season all the way to the championship game. So, of course, they were a 1 seed heading into that tournament. They had Drew Timme, Jalen Suggs, Corey Kispert, just an absolutely stacked team, and was the best team all season long until they met up to Davion Mitchell and Jared Butler and Matt Mayer in that squad of a Baylor Bears team that just destroyed them in the championship game. I thought that game was going to be super close. Those were the 2 best teams, and definitely by far the best any of these teams so far have finished as the preseason number 1 team. One of the best teams, if not the best team, to never win the championship. They were runner-ups that year in 2021. Now we go to 2020, and we do have Michigan State, and a lot of people were hyped for this 2020 Michigan State team. Cassius Winston's senior season. They had Xavier Tillman as well, but the tournament was canceled. Michigan State was going to make the March Madness tournament, and a lot of people believe they were one of the favorites to win the championship that year. So ultimately, we will never know how they would finish in the tournament, but they definitely were going to make it. So that Michigan State team was preseason number 1, but the tournament did get canceled. Next up in 2019, a familiar face and a face that we will see a few more times on this list, and that is Kansas. Kansas was the number 1 team heading into the 2018-2019 season, and they had Devin Dotson, Dedrick Lawson, Quentin Grimes. They had a stacked team full of a lot of talent, and they ultimately didn't finish as good as they were expected. They were once again a 4 seed after being the preseason number 1 team, and they lost to the 5-seeded Auburn team in the second round. That Auburn team went on to make it all the way to the Final Four, where they had an amazing game against Virginia, where they almost knocked off Virginia to make it to the championship game. A lot of people still believe Auburn should have won that game, and that is who Kansas lost to in the second round. Next up in 2018, we do have, for the first time, I'm surprised it's been this long since they were the preseason number 1 team, and that is the Duke Blue Devils. And they had a squad. This was Grayson Allen's senior season. They had Gary Trent Jr., Marvin Bagley, Wendell Carter Jr., just a squad filled with NBA talent, as Duke usually does have. And they were heading into the tournament as a 2 seed. So pretty good, preseason number 1 team. Still got a 2 seed, still had high expectations in the tournament, but they did end up losing to 1-seeded Kansas in the Elite 8 that season in Grayson Allen's senior year. Going back a year prior to the 2016-2017 season, we do have Duke again heading into this season as the number 1 team. Again, Grayson Allen was on this team. They had Brandon Ingram this year, Luke Kennard. Always flooding with NBA talent on these Duke teams. And once again, they were heading into the March Madness tournament as a 2 seed. This time they only made it to the second round, as they did lose to 7-seeded South Carolina. That's right, the Gamecocks, making their first ever Final Four in that season as well. So shout out to South Carolina. That was a very fun run by them as a 7 seed to knock off 2-seeded Duke and what was the preseason number 1 team that season. Ultimately made it all the way to the championship game, and we have our second team so far going back that lost in the championship game. They lost to Villanova in what is still one of the best games I've ever seen, and the best championship game I've ever watched as a college basketball fan. I mean, Villanova at the buzzer. Marcus Page right before that tied it with an insane circus shot three. And yeah, North Carolina did lose in the championship, went on to win it the next year in 2017. Now, back to 2014-2015 season. Heading into that year, we did have Kentucky. We had a lot of hype heading into this season after making it to the championship game the year prior and returning the Harrison twins, Willie Cauley-Stein, Karl Anthony Towns, Devin Booker, Willie Cauley-Stein, Trey Lyles, Tyler Ulis. I mean, just a absolute stacked team on this team. And a lot of people say if it wasn't that Gonzaga team in 2021 that we talked about, it is this year's 2015 Kentucky team, who people say were the best team to never win the championship. They ended up losing to Wisconsin and Frank Kaminsky in the Final Four in an amazing game, one of the best games of all time. The year before, it was Kentucky again, who was the preseason #1 team in the country. And again, they had Julius Randle, they had Willie Cauley-Stein, they had the Harrison brothers, but they actually didn't have that great of a regular season. I mean, they were pretty good, but not as good as expected. I mean, they were second in the SEC, but still only got an 8 seed that season. But they ended up still as an 8 seed, making it all the way to the championship game. So very up and down. Preseason #1 team, a lot of hype. Not so good regular season, get an 8 seed draw, which is not what they wanted. But still having the potential and going on a deep run all the way to the championship game. 7-seeded UConn in a 7 versus 8 seed national championship game, which was just awesome to see. The year before, we have an interesting #1 team heading into that year, 2012 to 2013, and that is the Indiana Hoosiers, who did have a lot of hype when they had Victor Oladipo and Cody Zeller on that team, and they lived up to that hype through the regular season as they were a #1 seed heading into the tournament. However, they did only make it to the Sweet 16 that year, where they did end up losing to 4-seeded Syracuse, who I do believe did go on to make it to the Final Four that season. Up the year before, we have our 2011-2012 preseason #1 team, and that was the North Carolina Tar Heels. They did have Kendall Marshall, who was definitely their best player that season, and they were a 1 seed in that year's March Madness tournament, so they did have a good year. They lived up to the hype through the regular season. However, in the second round, Kendall Marshall did suffer an injury which really hurt them in that game, because they did have to face a 2-seeded Kansas team in the Elite Eight. So even though Kendall Marshall went down in the second round, they still made it to the Elite Eight. But ultimately, without him, they couldn't get it done against 2-seed Kansas, and they did end up losing in that Elite Eight game. If they did have Kendall Marshall, I do believe North Carolina could have maybe went definitely to the Final Four. They had that potential. Next up, at 2011, we have our 2010-2011 season, and it was Duke heading into that year as the top dog, and they did have a very solid team. They had Nolan Smith on that team, Kyle Singler, and they also had Kyrie Irving, who didn't really play that much that season, but they still ended up being a #1 seed in that year's March Madness tournament. However, they did end up losing in the Sweet 16 to 5-seeded Arizona. So kind of a little bit of an upset there, only making it to the Sweet 16. So we are yet to see a preseason #1 team in the country go on to win the national championship. We've had, I believe, 3 teams who were runner-ups, but none yet. And here in the 2009-2010 season, we still do not have a champion because it was the Kansas Jayhawks of that season heading in as the number 1 team, and they did have a pretty solid regular season. I mean, really, they were dominating the Big 12 year in and year out at this time. They were a 1 seed. They had Marcus and Markieff Morris on this team, Sharon Collins, a lot of talent, but this was the year where they did lose in the second round. Kansas, more than anyone, has had very bad luck and maybe cursed as when it comes to being the number 1 team in the preseason, because they lost in the second round to Northern Iowa, who was a 9 seed. Ali Farouk-Manesh sent them home in the second round in an insane 3-pointer to just one of the best daggers in March Madness history. I'm sure most of you guys know what I'm talking about. Just a great upset. I'm just glad that I get to highlight it here, talking about them in this video. The year before, we finally have a team that was the preseason number 1 team who went on to win the championship, and that is your 2008-2009 North Carolina Tar Heels. They were the number 1 team heading into that year. That was Tyler Hansborough's senior season, and they ended up winning the championship that year in 2009. So finally, we do have to go back 16 to 17 years to find us a number 1 team that won the championship. Will Purdue, Houston, Florida, whoever ends up being the number 1 team this preseason, be able to break that curse? It's been so long. We will have to see. Next up in 2008, it was North Carolina again. Again, they did have Tyler Hansborough on that team. They were a 1 seed, and this time they made it to the Final Four and lost to Kansas, who did go on to beat Memphis and win the national championship that year. The year before that, we did have the Florida Gators, who again are now our second team. We had 2 in a 3-year span, the 2006-2007 Florida Gators, who had Corey Brewer, Joakim Noah, Al Horford, just a stacked team, one of the best college basketball teams of all time, 1 seed, went on to win the national championship that year. Just awesome to see 2 back-to-back here in the 2000s. The AP poll was really in their bag during this era of college basketball. They need to kind of get back to that because lately they haven't been doing such a great job. Next up, 2005-2006, it was, of course, Florida who won the championship again, but they were not the preseason number 1 team. That was the Duke Blue Devils, who did have J.J. Redick on this team, averaging 27 points per game, going absolutely ballistic in college. They ended up being a 1 seed, but ended up losing to 4-seeded LSU in the Sweet 16. So only making it to the Sweet 16, but J.J. Redick was going absolutely berserk in this season. What a year that was. 2004 to 2005, we do have Kansas again, and the curse continues for Kansas being the preseason number 1 team. They had Wayne Simeon, Keith Langford on this team, who were their leading scorers. They were a 3 seed heading in and lost in the first round to 14-seeded Bucknell. Just the curse continues for Kansas. They have, I believe, never made it past even the second round, maybe one of these years, because they were preseason number 1 a lot. Maybe one year they made it to the Sweet 16, but I don't think they made it past that as the preseason number 1 team, and I don't believe they made it past the second round, honestly. Next up, our 2003-2004 number 1 team heading into that year was the UConn Huskies. They were the 1 seed, and they are our 3rd team on this list. Like I said, the AP poll was really in their bag in this era, the 3rd team to win the championship after being the preseason number 1 team. This team had Ben Gordon, Emeka Okafor. I mean, this team was stacked. They were a 1 seed heading in, and they were the number 1 team heading out in the championship heading out of that season. Next up, our 2002-2003 preseason number 1 team were the Arizona Wildcats, and they were a 1 seed after that regular season, living up to the hype. They had Salim Stoudemire, Channing Frye, Luke Walton on this team. Very solid squad. And like I said, they were a 1 seed. They made it all the way to the Elite Eight, where they lost to 2-seeded Kansas that season. Now, our 2001-2002 number 1 team was the Duke Blue Devils, and this team had Carlos Boozer, Jay Williams, some experience on this team. Jay Williams, of course, been a part of some very good Duke teams already. And they were a 1 seed after that season, but ended up losing to the Indiana Hoosiers, who was a 5 seed in the Sweet 16. So definitely a disappointing season there, the way that ended for your 2002 Duke Blue Devils. The 2000-2001 number 1 team was the Arizona Wildcats once again. This team had Richard Dick Jefferson, Gilbert Agent Zero Arenas. Super stacked team. Unfortunately, was a 2 seed heading in, but made it all the way to the national championship, where they did lose to, as I mentioned before, Jay Williams, part of some really good teams. The 2001 Duke Blue Devils, who won the championship against Arizona. Very good championship game. And yeah, Arizona goes down on the list as another team who was number 1, who ended up losing in the championship game and were the runner-ups at the end of the year. And our last team that we are going to be talking about is our 1999-2000 number 1 team, and that was the UConn Huskies heading into that season. And they ended up being a 5 seed in that season, so definitely a disappointing regular season, but still 5 seed, still potential. UConn has done very good as an underdog, won as a 4 seed and as a 7 seed before in the March Madness tournament, won the entire thing, but as a 5 seed they were unable to do so, and they did lose to Tennessee in the second round. And that is going to do it for this video, guys. Let me know what you guys think about these teams. We've only had 3 teams ever as the preseason number 1 team who ended up going on to win the national championship. And I believe 3 more teams who went on all the way to the championship game. So pretty interesting stuff here, guys. It's been since 2009 since one of these teams has went on to win the championship. Will that be able to get broken this season? We will have to find out. I cannot wait to find out. Can't wait for the season. I hope you guys feel the same way, and I hope you guys subscribe, because we have a ton more content here on the channel and a lot coming, especially as the season is getting closer and closer. So make sure you guys subscribe, and thank you so much for watching.